Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. What happens when a man with a gentle face and a love for poetry decides to burn his country to the ground? How could a privileged student, a boy who adored French literature, become the architect of one of the 20th century's most brutal genocides? The story of Pol Pot is a chilling and bizarre descent into madness, a masterclass in psychological manipulation that turned a nation's dreams into a nightmare of blood, famine, and terror. His life began with a striking irony. Born Salif Sar in 1925, he was not the peasant revolutionary he would later claim to be. He was the son of a wealthy farmer with royal ties, and he spent his childhood in the quiet comfort of the Cambodian countryside. But the tranquil life of privilege did not satisfy his growing ambition. His early years were marked by a lack of distinction. He was a mediocre student, a shy and unassuming young man who seemed destined for a life of quiet obscurity. He failed to get into a prestigious high school, and in 1949 was sent to Paris to study radio electronics. It was there, amidst the cafes and intellectual fervor of post-war France, that a strange and sinister transformation took place. The Paris of the 1950s was a crucible of political thought, and Salif Sar, a man who had shown little academic promise, found his true calling. He fell in with a small circle of Cambodian radicals who met in secretive groups to discuss Marxist theory and anti-colonialism. He wasn't a charismatic orator or a brilliant strategist, but he possessed a quiet, intense fanaticism. He failed his exams, his scholarship was revoked, and he returned to Cambodia a disillusioned and unemployed man. This failure, however, was his first great plot twist. The man who could not succeed in the Western world would decide that the Western world itself was the very poison from which his country needed to be saved. He returned not to a life of quiet defeat, but with a terrifying, absolute certainty. He had found his life's purpose in a radical and violent ideology. Back in Cambodia, Salif Sar vanished from public life, immersing himself in the burgeoning anti-colonial movement. He taught history and geography at a small private school, but his true work was happening in the shadows. He joined the communist movement, a small and fractured group that was a fringe player in Cambodia's politics. For years, he operated in near-total anonymity, a phantom of the Communist Party, and in a clever and chilling move, he adopted the name Pol Pot. No one knew his real identity. This was his great hook, a leader with no face, a voice in the dark. The political situation in Cambodia was growing more and more unstable. As the Vietnam War raged on its border, the country was plunged into chaos. The United States began a bombing campaign to flush out North Vietnamese forces hiding in Cambodia, a devastating and indiscriminate war that killed tens of thousands of peasants and destroyed the very fabric of Cambodian society. The Khmer Rouge, once a tiny, inconsequential movement, suddenly found itself with a powerful recruitment tool. The indiscriminate American bombings drove thousands of angry and desperate peasants into their arms. The rural population, once content in their quiet villages, was now a traumatized, weaponized force. And Pol Pot was their silent leader. The next big surprise came in 1975, after years of brutal civil war. The Khmer Rouge, a force that had been an invisible boogeyman to most Cambodians, stormed the capital city of Phnom Penh. The city's inhabitants, weary and starving, poured into the streets to welcome what they believed would be their liberation. But instead of peace, they were met with the terrifying reality of Pol Pot's vision. Without a single exception, the entire city was ordered to be evacuated. All 2 million inhabitants, men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, and even those in hospitals were forced at gunpoint to abandon their homes. This was the launch of Year Zero. All private property was abolished, money was burned, and all Western influence was to be erased. Pol Pot's vision was a twisted fantasy of an agrarian utopia, a pure, uncorrupted society that would be built from scratch. To achieve this, Cambodia had to be cleansed of its past. The new people, as the city dwellers were called, were considered poisoned by Western ideas, education, and money. The Khmer Rouge cadre, led by Pol Pot, considered themselves the old people, the true bearers of the peasant spirit. The nation's doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, and monks were either immediately executed or sent to work camps in the countryside, their skills and knowledge a mark of their corruption. The journey to these camps was an act of brutal attrition, a death march where thousands perished from starvation, exhaustion, and disease. This shocking, total reset of a country was a horrifying and unprecedented act in modern history, and it was just the beginning. The countryside became a vast labor camp where every individual, regardless of their background, was a forced laborer in service of the regime. The new people were subjected to a grueling routine, forced to toil from before dawn until long after dusk with only a meager, watery rice porridge to sustain them. This relentless cycle of starvation and exhaustion was deliberately designed to break the human spirit and eliminate any thought of resistance. The rules were absolute, and any transgression, no matter how minor, was considered a treasonous act against Ankar, the anonymous ruling party. A small theft of food, a whispered complaint, or even the secret attempt to read a book were met with immediate and violent consequences. But the ultimate betrayal, the unpardonable sin, was a sign of education or pre-revolutionary life. The Khmer Rouge cadre, many of whom were uneducated themselves, were trained to look for small, subtle hints of a person's intelligence, which they saw as a sign of corruption. Smooth, uncalloused hands were evidence of a life not spent in manual labor. The use of a foreign word, or the simple act of wearing glasses, were also considered immediate grounds for execution. This was a war against memory, a campaign to eradicate the entire pre-revolutionary past by systematically destroying its intellectual class and cultural artifacts. Libraries were burned, temples were desecrated, and all forms of art, music, and literature were forbidden. The regime's goal was to wipe the slate clean, to create a blank canvas upon which their twisted utopia could be painted. The paranoia reached a fever pitch. Pol Pot, from his secret compound in the capital, began to turn on his own people. He believed that even within the revolution, there were spies and traitors lurking in the shadows. His purges were relentless and indiscriminate, consuming anyone suspected of disloyalty. These purges were a reflection of his own deep-seated insecurity and the inherent flaw in his ideology. An all-powerful secretive party that distrusted everyone, including its own members. Members of his own party, his closest allies, and even his family members were systematically arrested, tortured, and executed in what became known as the killing fields. The most infamous of these killing centers was the Tul Slang prison, a former high school in Phnom Penh. It was here that the paranoia became a perverse and meticulous art form. The Khmer Rouge guards, many of them barely teenagers, carried out methodical interrogations and tortures, meticulously recording every confession and detail in a chilling and macabre filing system. Prisoners, starved and shackled, were forced to write confessions that implicated themselves, their families, and their friends in fabricated plots against the state. The prison became a factory of death, where people were tortured until they confessed to absurd crimes, then taken to the killing fields for execution. Over 17,000 prisoners were processed here, and only 7 survived, a testament to the regime's absolute and unforgiving nature. The sheer scale of the paranoia was staggering. No one was safe, and the revolution had begun to devour its own in a terrifying display of self-destruction. The nightmare ended as abruptly as it began. In 1979, the Vietnamese army, fed up with constant border skirmishes and the brutality of the Khmer Rouge, invaded Cambodia and easily overthrew Pol Pot's regime. The world finally saw the true scale of the horror: the skeletal remains of millions, the makeshift graves, and the countless stories of unimaginable suffering. It is estimated that up to 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the country's population, died during the 4 years of the Khmer Rouge regime. Yet, in a final and unsettling twist, Pol Pot himself was never fully brought to justice. He escaped into the jungle, where he led a small guerrilla force and continued to be recognized by some as the rightful leader of Cambodia. He lived out his days in the shadows, a forgotten tyrant in the very land he had so brutally ravaged. He died in 1998, reportedly of a heart attack, an old man in hiding, and was given a traditional funeral. His legacy is a haunting question. How did a revolution meant to bring about a classless society lead to the systematic extermination of so many of its own people? How could the leader of a nation's liberation movement become its most terrifying executioner? The story of Pol Pot remains a chilling reminder that the most insidious evil can often be found in the quiet, unassuming shadows of history.